Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You're listening to a new episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore. We are all lifelong learners, and nowhere is this more relevant than in the practice of leadership. Our goal is continual learning and improvement. Let's get after it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hey folks, this is MK Palmore. Welcome to another edition of the Leadership Student Podcast. Today I am joined by Charlene Li, who is currently the Chief Research Officer for PA Consulting. Charlene's had a distinguished career. She's both an author and someone who spent time not only in the research lanes, but doing some disruptive work as it relates to leadership. So we're excited to have her in as a guest for the Leadership Student and maybe take a different angle on the subject of leadership with her. So Charlene, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Charlene, I see on your LinkedIn profile that you're an author. Some folks listening may not know who you are or anything about your background. So if you wouldn't mind helping us level set on what you're doing in the industry now and maybe a little bit about your background, that'd be cool.
Sure. Yeah, I have been a long-time analyst in the technology and business space and also an author. I worked at a analyst firm called Forrester Research, analyzing the internet, search, marketing, and search engines, social media. And so I was right at the cusp of so many of these changes that have happened over the past 20 years. And then in 2008, wrote my first book called Groundswell, talking about how companies can use these social technologies. And then went off and started my own firm called Altimeter Group and sold it in 2015 to a consulting firm. I was there for a while and then joined PA about a year ago as a chief research officer. I like to say that research is my love. I love doing it, but what drives it is the ability to use it to help catalyze transformation. And that's what my work really does. It doesn't just do research for the sake of doing research. It really is with the purpose of explaining these new trends and helping people tap into them and be able to use them to advance themselves or organizations and society.
So can you pull the thread back on that a little bit? It seems very interesting. It's almost a confluence or an intersection between what we're seeing in the technology industry and maybe some of the things that we're now becoming reliant on as it relates to technology, but how that maybe influences the ability for folks to lead and actually engage with people.
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking about leadership because all of these social technologies really challenged the ways that we think about influence and power and control, leadership, basically. And we've seen now that you can be a thought leader or an influencer without any particular title inside an organization. So that's a big challenge to traditional power structures and leadership. So what does it mean to be a leader then in this era? It's something I realized we needed to talk about that. And I always believe that leadership is built on relationships between people who aspire to create change and people who are inspired to follow them. That has always been the case. And it's even more so now that these technologies, these advances are changing the way we lead because of the way we create relationships with people. And that's happening literally right in front of us. With the pandemic and remote working, with generative AI, all of these things are changing the way we have to lead.
So would it be fair to say or to proffer that the way that we exercise the discipline of leadership has changed dramatically over the years, and the role that technology is playing probably can't be understated then in terms of its impact on how people show up day to day, right?
I think there are some things that have been and always will be true about leadership. The things that, that people have to trust you, they have to believe you. You earn the right to be a leader by being credible. Your track record speaks to these things. But the way that you go about establishing that credibility is now changed because of technology and the ways that, again, we communicate, the way we establish relationships. So if you don't understand, and we talk about generational gaps, and I oftentimes think, well, this generation we just don't understand them. They don't understand us. That has always been the case. When we were 20-something, so like, what are these old fogies in their 50s and 60s doing? They just don't get us, right? I mean, Gen X and I mean, when we came along, they were like, oh, these Gen Xers, they don't know how to work. And now we're Gen Xers and we're looking at the Gen Z, it's like, oh, they don't know how to work. These millennials are very entitled. And there's always a generational change and shift. That's always been the case. But it's exacerbated in some ways because of the technologies and the ways we tend to communicate and establish relationships and develop trust with each other.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the Generation X profile in this. I am also part of that generation. And I've often heard, as I'm a father of 3 now, that the current generation is one of the first to grow up with technology being so present in their lives. But that's not actually an accurate statement. And I would say that for Gen Xers, I think we may have been the first generation to whom had widespread access to things like computers. And it was really the beginning of what was the consumer engagement with technology. And so I think it puts us in an interesting point to kind of have a foot in both realms. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. And I think the generation before us, the boomers, were the first ones who actually had television and telephones and could travel by air to all different parts of the world. That they would actually have relationships with people that were completely by telephone, that couldn't be imagined by the greatest generation before them. So I think in every generation, we have been moving forward to think about these and technology in all its various forms, even as simple as like the steam engine has fundamentally changed our lives. It's just different forms of technology. I do have to say, in over 2 decades of covering technologies, I've never seen something develop as quickly as generative AI. It is going to have a huge and fundamental change in the way that we live our lives and the way we work with each other.
So before we get to what the future might hold, can you tease out a little bit of what you found in research in terms of technology's impact on leadership today? You touched on some of it, this idea of remote work, definitely different, right? Leading teams remotely. We have situations now where leaders never actually meet the people on their team in person, or at least there's restricted environments in terms of the folks' ability to travel. What kind of impact does that currently have? What's the research shown? And how do you see, from a leadership standpoint, like what kinds of things do we need to be aware of as leaders to make sure that we can still have the same or a better level of effectiveness in terms of leading teams?
I think you just hit on it. It's the same or better, because I think because we have to be so much more thoughtful and intentional about our leadership, we're actually becoming better leaders. I'll give you an example. When somebody joined a company in the past, the onboarding typically was, okay, you have a half day of onboarding. Here's your laptop. Here's wherever your desk is. And this is where the lunchroom is. Okay, now follow this person around and do what they do. That was onboarding. Now when you're remote, like, okay, you have a whole week. Like, this is what our culture looks like. These are our values. These are the ways we communicate. These are our processes. This is how we resolve conflicts. And you get a whole lowdown now about what the company does, how it works, what our culture looks like, how do we intentionally create culture. Whereas before, we were just kind of loosey-goosey about it because we were there to hopefully guide it and catch it and correct it in real time, but maybe not.
That's a fantastic point. So what you're stepping into is this idea that we've been forced now to kind of codify things that we left to be squishy, so to speak. You know, the culture is oftentimes hard to define, I think, and the culture is one of those things that you absolutely have to digest and get used to when you come into a new professional environment. So we've been forced to codify these things and actually put them down so that we can really get folks up to speed at a distance and in some cases in a quicker fashion. That's different.
Yeah, it is. I have team members who I've never met. I've written books with people that I never see. I mean, that's a huge collaboration over a long period of time. You know, I've worked with writers, authors who I didn't see at all through the whole book writing process. I'm a longtime editor, I've yet to meet her in person, right? So, and the reality is that relationship is really strong because we laid the foundation of how we're going to work together. We're collaborating constantly. We're using the tools to communicate with each other. We're swapping things back and forth. There's no need for us to have to sit next to each other. Even though she just lives on the other side of the bay, maybe 45-minute drive from me, I haven't actually seen her in real life. And we've worked on several books together. And I'm like, why haven't I done that? But I feel like I can talk to her at any point, ping her any point, and stay absolutely connected with her. So these relationships are absolutely valid. They're real. They're really tangible. And it's not to lessen them, but they are different than being in person. When you are in person, you can communicate so much better and faster, especially about touchy, emotional issues, because you can read body language and all these things. There's no substitute for that. The level of bonding and trust that you develop, especially in a group environment where you can bond together around shared experiences, there's no replacement of that. But it is different. And just because you have that doesn't mean that you can't have this discipline around creating the kind of culture that you want as a leader.
So what are some of the tools that leaders today have available to them to do things like build teams? And I ask that question because my personal experience and background has been that the tactile nature of teams being in person actually, I think, creates much stronger bonds than we can build at a distance from one another. So maybe you have some contrary thoughts to that. What do you think about
Again,
team
I
building in
absolutely
modern
believe
day?
that's true. Because when you can come together and have a shared experience, a bonding experience, whether to celebrate or to deal with a particular problem, when you have that level of experience with each other, it develops a certain level of intimacy and trust that can't be replaced. You can still replicate some of it in some cases where you're working intensely together on a project, or you can celebrate it together, but it's just not quite the same because we, as humans, are necessarily very tactile, very visual, very audible, and there's only so much that a two-dimensional screen can give you of that. But at the same time, there's something you can do with technology that you could never do before. I talked to one CEO, and he said, I really like going out and shaking hands with every single person that I meet. I really make an effort to go out there and talk to people, really get to the front lines and talk to people. And I go, you have 10,000 people in your organization. You have no chance of being able to talk to every single one of them all the time if the only way you're going to do this is face-to-face. What if instead you talk to each other eye to eye, keyboard to keyboard? The scale of listening and communication that you can have is at such a different level that you could never have imagined. So why wouldn't you avail yourself of that? It's not to say it replaces it, right, but it's another way to be able to listen, to build foundation, to understand what the reality is going on at the very front lines or with the customers throughout the organization without it having to be filtered. CEOs tell me the hardest part of their jobs is to knowing what the truth is, what's really going on, because it keeps getting filtered through so many of the lenses, and for better or for worse, it just gets filtered up to them. So being able to go to source, being able to tap into the front lines, being able to talk directly to hundreds, if not thousands of customers instantaneously is a huge game changer when it comes to leadership.
You bring up a fantastic example. Because I, during the pandemic, had a recent experience with that with a global CEO, a company of, more than 10,000 employees, took advantage of the availability then of this engagement mechanism that you and I are communicating on and was able to have these small groups of employees. When I say small, though, I mean hundreds as opposed to just going in, as you say, and walking in and meeting 10 or 12 employees at a time. And I can tell you the sentiment after those sessions where we had direct access to the CEO, the sentiment was extremely high. People felt really good about just, even if it was just the opportunity to make a statement, and they knew the CEO heard it, right? As opposed to, as you say, passing something up the chain, and you don't know how it's going to be filtered or how the messaging is going to be provided to that individual who's in a leadership position. So, a great example. Great example.
Yeah, I mean, when you know what the impact is, if you're a leader and you reach out to somebody, you shook their hand, you looked at them, you wish them a happy birthday, you recognize them in the elevator and you know their name. I mean, it makes a huge impact because they think like, wow, you actually know who I am. You actually heard me. I have a voice. And it has a ripple effect because they then share with everybody else, I got listened to. And this idea that you matter, that you have impact, that you have agency is so incredibly important, that you have ownership over the outcomes, Uh, these are really important hallmarks of a really strong culture and a very strong organization that you want to foster as a leader at all levels of the organization. And we also know that people communicate in different ways. Not everyone's going to be extroverted and feel comfortable to raise your hand in a meeting of 10,000 people and to ask a question. Other people may want to reflect and just go back and like, wait a minute, I haven't thought about this. And that's when they can type it on their keyboard, send a note, comment on an internal blog, an email, posting it in a discussion group internally, and say, hey, I had an idea. And it means so much to have somebody in the organization. It hasn't even have to be the CEO, but someone else that sees that because anybody can access that. And like, that's a really interesting idea. Can we set up some time to talk about that? Because we've been thinking about this. And when you have that breaking down of these power hierarchies, when you can reduce the distance of power and you can make it more egalitarian, you may not always want to have that, but when you can strategically say, when is it beneficial to the organization to allow us to have greater transparency and open information sharing, enabling us to move faster with better information, then that could be a huge advantage.
So what are some of the tools that I'll call mid-level leaders or folks who may be new to leadership? What kind of tools do they have available to them now that can help them prepare for this new vision of leadership?
It's not even technology. I think it's more mindset. I believe that the most simple technologies can be used, but without the right mindset, you're never going to use the technology in the right way. And the mindset, I would say, is really thinking about leadership as a relationship. I keep mentioning that. But really truly defining what kind of relationship do you want with the people you lead? What would it look like? What does it feel like from your perspective? What does it look like and feel like from the people you're leading? What does it look like from their perspective? What do they want? And our research found that people have very different motivations for the kind of work relationship they want. Sometimes they're very passive. They just want to come to the work. They want to keep their head down, do the work, just tell me what to do, tell me what excellent looks like. I'll do my job and go home because I'm working to live. There are some people who may be much more engaged. They believe in the mission. They want to do extra work. They make an extra effort because they see that if the company does well, I've got to do well too as well. And then you have the power holders who are a very unique group. And they will do a lot of things that they engage people, but they will go beyond that because there are certain things that they believe in that they want the company to also do. They believe that the customers can be treated better. They believe the supply chain can be treated in a much more holistic way. They believe in sustainability. They believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lots of things that are challenges for the organization that they don't think the organization is doing as well. And they see themselves as being in a position to make a difference. That sense of agency, of ownership of this is really unique amongst this group of people, and they are in all parts of the organization, but they're especially prevalent and over-emphasized in the middle management space. Because this is historically a very disenfranchised group, and yet in many ways they see themselves as the keepers of this power to be able to make that change happen because the buck begins and stops with them.
So you opened the door to a topic that's a bit of a passion topic of mine, and that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And, this is relatively of recent note. This idea of emphasis around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a relatively new thing. What kind of impact do you think that's having on leaders and how they show up? And
huge impact.
Yeah, the kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge and difficult impact that people are having. I mean, as you have known in having discussions with leaders, some leaders absolutely believe in it, support it. Others are like, okay, kind of get it. I know it's important, but not doing very much. And others are like, do I really have to do this? Do I really need to do this? It seems like a total pain. It's a distraction. It's going to cost us more money. And so there's ample amounts of research that shows that more inclusive environments where people really strongly feel like they belong, where you have psychological safety, these organizations do so much better than ones that do not. And one of the benefits of having an inclusive environment is that you will encourage people to show up in the best way that they can, that they have the safety to be able to do that different opinions can exist in the same space, that we're looking for culture add, not culture fit, that excludes different types of voices. And then when that happens, that's when diversity of opinions, of backgrounds and experiences can really thrive. And we usually do it the opposite way. We look at the numbers and then we try to create inclusion and belonging. But you have to actually start with the whole idea that belonging is a really important thing to create right from the get-go. Because unless you have that, the other things won't happen.
So I've always felt that this idea of allowing folks to bring their whole selves to the workspace or show up fully at work, like innately for me, I believe that means that if you create an environment where that is the norm, people will actually be more productive. Some of the pushback that we hear in the industry around this issue of DEI or DEI and B relates to like, what's the business case? And to me, it seems like the business case is already being made. It's like it's baked into the issue. And it seems odd to me that people don't recognize that. But you were just touching on the idea that I think you were maybe not expressing it in these words, but people are actually more productive when they feel they can bring their whole selves into a work environment or team environment.
I love the whole idea of the whole self. And when I do my development work and assessment work with team members, again, first of all, I separate the two. There's performance and there's development. Do not mix the two up. Right. When we're talking about development, I really ask, I want to understand the whole person here. What drives you? What motivates you? What are your long-term plans? And I have this saying where we're going to talk about your last day on the first day of work. Meaning, let's be real here. You're not going to work here forever. You're going to work here. We're going to be enthusiastic. At some point, your skills are going to expand and you're going to want to do something different. Either, hopefully we can find a position here in the company, but if we can't, I completely understand. If we are not advancing you in your growth path, we should get out of the way to help you find that next position. So my commitment to you, because frankly, once we start working together, we're going to be connected for the rest of our lives, like it or not. Then I want to do everything possible to make sure you're on that path, that you are employable in the best way possible, either inside my company or outside of it. And then when it comes time for us to part ways, we would do so in a thoughtful way, in a way filled with integrity. None of this going out for lunch with a friend when you're going out for an interview. No, I want to know what you're looking for. In fact, I'll help you look for that job. In return, I ask that you commit 100% to doing the common purpose and objectives you want to have, and help me find your replacement, get them trained up, maybe even show them how they can do a better job than you could, because you're just further along in terms of understanding the requirements of the job. I was really committed to this when that people who had been at the company for 2 years, we would sit down and like, you've been thinking about these other things in our development talks. You need to go and explore those. I mean, that's a real interest of yours, and I can't provide that. I can support it in some ways, but you need to go interview, do some informational interviews. I have some people who could be really helpful for you. And it makes total sense. I'm not trying to get rid of them. I'm really trying to help them find out what they really want to do. Most of the time, 80% of the time, they come back like, yeah, I checked it out. I scratched that itch. It's not that interesting. I'd rather be doing what I'm doing here. And they're now even more focused on what they want to do. So my retention rates were through the roof of a very diverse workplace because of these types of conversations we have right from day one, right from the hiring process.
What you describe is such a mature approach to leadership. And I have to push back on it only to the extent that it's not a reality, I think, for most managers, leaders, and folks in industry today. I have oftentimes approached my leadership positions with the idea that my job, partly as a leader, is to get my team to where they want to be. But I think you infinitely more eloquently pull back some of the threads on that, like having that conversation up front. What does your last day in the enterprise look like? Like, what would you have liked for your time here to have looked like? And it's such a mature way, I think, to look at it as people developing, like that they are going to develop skills, capabilities that may very well take them outside to a position outside of your firm. And you should actually be encouraging that, because during the time that they are with you, they will knock it out of the park performance-wise.
Right. And it just seemed like such, I think the way you put it was a mature way of thinking about this. And it just always struck me, like, why would you want to encourage people to be immature about this, to have it be a personal thing that you're betraying and being disloyal to the company for leaving when you couldn't provide them with the opportunities that they wanted to pursue their careers and their long-term employability? It just seems so silly. And let's just be grown up about this and realize that, yeah, people leave. It's a regretted departure. But does it have to be regretted? What if it was actually planned? There was a great book called The Alliance, written by Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn, and a few other people, Ben Casanova and Chris Ye. Fantastic book that talked about, it's a tour of duty you're signing up for. You're signing for a 2-year tour of duty. This is the job. And as the tour of duty ends, you're coming to a conversation and say, well, do you want to sign up for another tour of duty? How do you want this to change? What does it look like? It's having those kinds of conversations that just makes a lot of sense.
That certainly resonates with me. Certainly, the description of it being a tour of duty. I've never thought about it that way, but it is, and I think we would, as team leaders, be infinitely better positioned, I think, to help develop our teammates as we think about them matriculating through the process, as opposed to landing, staying, and how much time can I get out of this one individual in order to devote to this individual cause. And it's really an inappropriate way to think about it. First of all, it's not realistic. And then it's certainly not helpful to your team members to think about it in that context.
It's an old, outdated way of thinking about human resource as an asset that is fixed in time and something to be exploited and used up, versus something to be invested in and developed and to be grown. Because you have no idea where it's going to grow to. It may be growing inside the organization. Maybe they'll stay for 20, 30 years. Some organizations are really, really good at retaining people and moving them around and giving those challenges. I mean, it's amazing that people can do that. But not all organizations are built that way. Sometimes they're changing constantly, and they may have to get rid of an entire division because it's no longer the business they need to be in. Their customers aren't interested in that space anymore. And when that happens, you have a responsibility as an organization to say, we're transiting, we're moving over this direction. We're going to provide you with new skills. And if you can't, we'll provide you with a way to find a new position. We'll do everything possible. We know this is going to happen in 18 months, a year and a half, not 2 weeks from now.
Right.
That's a very different way of leading. It's a very mature, thoughtful, responsible way, ethical way of thinking about the business and planning as far in advance as possible so that the people are impacted in not the least possible harmful way, but in the best possible way to advance themselves.
How is this landing with your clients or the folks that you guys deal with from PA Consulting? Like how are they adopting and or digesting this approach, which quite frankly, I mean, it requires a bit of a reset for leaders to look at and view leadership in the terms like you've described.
It is a reset. And again, I keep coming back to this fundamental question. What kind of relationship do you want? What does it look like? Can we think truly out of the box and say, what does work look like? How do we define work? Because the traditional way of thinking about work and employment as a full-time gig, where you come into work and you work at the company for 20, 30 years, just doesn't exist anymore. So what does it look like? What does it feel like? If we know it's not going to be an employment for 20 years, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How do we actually deal with that reality? What kind of relationship do you want to have after they leave? Are they going to be good alumni? Will you have an alumni program? Do you want people to be referring people back to you? Will they become customers themselves? What does that relationship look like? That all determines how you work with each other, how you treat, how you communicate with each other, how you compensate each other, how you, again, build the fundamental things like psychological safety, sense of inclusion and belonging. Those things really matter if that relationship is going to go on for decades. You would approach work in a very different way.
I mean, it probably fair to say that you spent not just research time, but a lot of time thinking about the impact that leaders have on their teams. When was this topic first a reality for you? Like, at what point did a light bulb go off? Was there a personal experience that you had with a leader that caused you to begin sort of taking this different vantage point and view of leadership?
Yeah, it was interesting. When I left one company after almost 10 years, it was a not very mature company, and they said, well, you're being so disloyal for leaving. And I go, I stayed here for 10 years. How am I being disloyal for leaving? And I was leaving because I couldn't find an opportunity to continue to grow. They basically wanted me to go back into the box that I was in before and not continue to expand. And I kept exploring different ways and suggestions and ideas, and it just wasn't happening. So I said, with all due respect, I need to leave now because I can't continue on my growth path. And it was seen as disloyal. And I just went, wow, after 10 years, this is what it comes down to. And that's why it could have been so different. It could have been, wow, you've done 10 years. I'm so sorry we couldn't find a way to agreement. We wish you the best of luck. Here are ways that we can support you. We hope that you'll continue to refer clients to us, continue to do work with us wherever you go. We want to stay in touch. And then it's just cutting it off. I'm like, wow, it's very, very personal.
Right.
Right. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way. So that's when I started my firm. I'm like, I'm never going to do that. I want to make sure that each person coming in knows that this relationship is for life, that this is something, for better or for worse, we may do great work together. We may end on bad terms, but we're going to do so from a point of integrity. It was one of our core values that integrity is knowing that we're good with each other. We're going to invest in the communications to know that we're clear with each other and that we can move forward. Because otherwise, if that's not there, we cannot continue to work. We literally would stop things and like, wait, there's something I need to clear and check out and check in on something here. Because we have this value of integrity, and I don't feel like I'm in integrity with you. Can you take a moment and we can live into our value at this moment? So our values really allowed us to work through these tough points, not just with the good times, but they really came up for us at points where there were conflicts. And we would say, wait a minute, why is this bothering me? And usually we get upset and angry about things when our values are not respected. And so we would go right back to this, like what value is not being heard and expressed at this moment? And then we could talk about it.
So I love what you're talking about there, because this, what you call integrity, I've oftentimes labeled transparency in the relationship. And that's whether you're colleagues on par with one another or whether or not there's a supervisory relationship. But it's so important, and in the same breath, so difficult to be fully transparent. Can you talk a little bit about how you just described from the vantage point of integrity how important it is, but I mean, this to me sounds like one of the key things about this relationship that you enter into in the workforce, and I can't underscore enough that it's important. I'm still working on it personally as a senior leader, but it's super important to me.
I tell you, I wrote a whole book about this called Open Leadership, and I wrote it back in 2010 after my first book about groundswell, which is how companies can use social. And this one CEO came up to me and goes, "Okay, I get it. I need to be open, transparent, authentic. How open do I need to be?" And I'm like, that's a really good question. And the answer I came down to, all these, and I explored all the different ways it can be open. It can be open about information. It can be open about decision making and all these things. But what it comes down to, in order to have that relationship thrive, how much information, how transparent do you need to be for that relationship to develop into the type of relationship you want? We are all in relationships in our lives. Are we ever 100% authentic and transparent and open in any of our relationships in our lives? And I'm talking about the deepest, most meaningful relationships in our lives. There are still some things that we keep very private. There are still some things that we just know, there's a time and place for it, and maybe not for some other things too. We are always going to keep some things in check. But it's when we're able to be open and transparent, where there is that trust, there is a sense of belonging, that I can be truly open and transparent about what's really going on, what's motivating me. And especially when something is coming into that relationship to cause friction, that transparency, that openness and authenticity is going to make that so much better, because you can call into it. I talk about vulnerability and how difficult it is because it makes you feel really vulnerable as a leader. And yet we know that vulnerability, humility, all these really hard words to practice, they sound great, but they're really hard to practice because it feels unsafe, it feels dangerous. But the strongest leaders know that that vulnerability comes from a point of strength and confidence. And that allows them to be that open, transparent, authentic human, capable of making mistakes, capable of saying, I wasn't right, and that's okay. You weren't right, and that's okay. And we can move forward together still.
How important is that ability to reflect on successes and failures in relationship in terms of how you move forward?
I think it is the foundation of all relationships because no relationship is perfect. No relationship is perfect. I mean, just look at our personal relationships, our friendships, our spousal relationships, our love relationships, our family relationships. None of them are perfect. And it's going into them knowing that we're not perfect as people and our relationships continue to need work and investment and generation. That's what keeps work relationships also true and alive. I mean, these are the truisms of leadership. It's a relationship. And yet we don't treat it like one. We don't invest in it. We don't think about it. We don't tend to it. And the sooner we can think about leadership as a relationship and defining what that relationship can and should look like, the sooner we can be intentional and investing and strategic into what the outcomes are going to be.
Tell us a little bit about your most recent work, written work, the last book you wrote.
The last book I wrote was called The Disruption Mindset. And it was about looking at how companies were disrupting themselves and driving exponential, huge, transformative, disruptive growth. And because people would say, how do I disrupt myself? And I'm like, good question. How do you actually drive disruptive growth? And so I looked at all these companies and not the traditional usual suspects like Netflix or Facebook or Google. And these were schools, universities, art museums, banks, telecom companies, people who you don't necessarily think of as disruptive, who were doing some really disruptive things. And so the key is to look to the future, to understand who your future customer is and do everything possible today to make the changes necessary to be able to go pursue that future customer. Because unless you make those changes today, you're just going to fall further and further behind. If you only focus on the current customers, you're never investing in the future. So these disruptive companies have a really strong idea and focus on who that future customer is, and they're doing things today to be able to pursue them. That's the fundamental way. That's the fundamental thing about disruptive mindset, is that you're going to pursue growth, you're going to pursue that future, even though it's super hard, because growth in the end means that you have to do things differently, and it is uncomfortable, and you have to prepare for that discomfort.
Yeah, it strikes me that our old perception of maybe what is the strategy teams and technology companies are responsible for doing just that, like sort of looking over the horizon and seeing where the company needs to be in the next 18 to 24 months or maybe even years, having that eye forward so that the operations team can concentrate on what's happening today, but really keeping it focused. That seems like a really hard task to have folks with an eye towards the future, but also people paying attention to what's happening now. Have you seen in your research and the companies that you spoke to, this doesn't sound easy. How are they able to actually effectively do it, and what kind of intentionality is involved in that?
The question I like to ask is that there are 3 questions that every single employee in your company should be able to answer. And that is, who is your future customer? Can you define them? What is a strategy to meet them where they want to be, their needs and wants? And what is your job in making that a reality? And what that does, it puts into context the execution of what you're doing today in the context of that future. And so I could be focused on the customer of today, but the reason why that is so important is that we need the cash, we need the operating revenues from working with those customers of today in order to fund this future. And at the same time, keep talking to your customers, understanding how they are changing. Because if they match anything that looks like the future customer, you've got to send up the red flare and say, hey, I've got a future customer here. let's go and listen, let's examine, let's learn as much as we can, because we have one of them right here in front of us. We actually found one right here today. We don't have to wait for the future. Right. So when everyone in the organization is clear about what that strategy is, where we're going in the future, then everyone can be supporting that. Even if the things they're doing at that particular moment aren't necessarily about focusing on the future, but we know where we're going. There's a story that John F. Kennedy used to like to tell. He would visit the Houston Space Center, and he was walking down the hallway one of his tours, and he came across a janitor, and he said, "So, what are you doing here? Like, what's your job here?" He goes, "Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." And so that sense of mission, of why they're doing something, is such an important thing. Like, why am I doing this? What's my purpose? What's my impact going to be? How am I supporting something bigger than just that little bit that I'm doing? So I could be a passive, clock it in 9 to 5 person in the job, but I know why. I know what the purpose of me being here is. That's alignment. That's strategic. That is leadership, being super clear. This is where we are today. This is where we're going in the future. This is why we're going in the future. And this is what your job is to help make that a reality. Very simple questions. Very, very few companies have the confidence to say that. Most people in my organization know how to answer those 3 questions.
So I love that take on it. And I was certainly familiar with the story you told about President Kennedy and asking the janitor what their role was there at NASA. And it's so important, I think, to have that task-oriented sort of mission embodied at every level of the organization. And as you noted, extremely difficult to actually accomplish that.
Right. And you have to wonder, why is that? Why is it so difficult to do? And this is the biggest challenge of leadership. It's always been the challenge of leadership. How do I balance the long term and the short term? How do I balance dealing with the crisis of the moment? And I've been writing about and thinking about what we're in today. We're in a perma crisis, which is like crisis after another, and it never seems to stop. We used to be able to say, once we get to this crisis, then we can pick up everything again. This is no end to sight. And so when you have that crisis of the moment you're dealing with constantly, how do you pick up the eyes and look to the future? It is probably the most difficult thing we have to do as leaders. The Eisenhower matrix, being able to look at the important, not the urgent.
Right.
So it comes down to that discipline of understanding, because if you don't do this, who else is going to do it? If you don't focus on the future as a leader, who else is going to think about it? So I do a lot of work with the top leaders of the organization, and one of the first things we do is we look at their calendar and we digest which of these meetings are the ones that are ones. They are really good meetings where you really felt you moved the ball forward. It was strategic. It was this future looking. I mean, you think about these the legendary offsites, which of them are like, that's really moving the ball forward, create alignment, would create agreement. Which of them are 3s? They were just like a total use of time. And then which are 2s that could potentially become 1s? And when you look at your diary, you should be going to all 1s, not going to any 3s. And then looking at your 2s and saying, how can I make those better or delegate them to somebody else? And what you realize is the vast majority of the things that you believe you have to do as a leader, is to justify you feeling like you're doing something on a day-to-day, so they feel better about having accomplished something, versus truly being the leader that is needed in that moment, which is looking at these strategic issues and then having the confidence to delegate everything else to other people. I was speaking to the president of Southwest Airlines, and I was asking him, how much of your time is spent on like medium and future looking things? And he said, 50% of my time. I'm like, you're kidding me? That much time? He goes, yeah, who else is going to do it? I spend 50% of my time, and I really try to cap it out that dealing with the operational things. And this is the president who deals with operational things. And he goes, if I'm the only person, if I have to be involved in this, then I'll deal with that. But anything else that somebody else could do, I have to delegate it. Otherwise, my calendar will be filled with meeting after meeting of operational work.
Right.
We sometimes as leaders feel like we need to be involved in these things to validate our existence. And it's just the opposite. You validate your existence by not having to be in those meetings because you've done such a good job at elevating other leaders and delegating to them and giving them the agency to take the steps needed. That's humming along. You don't need to be involved unless on an exception basis. That's
amazing. Amazing. I think you've helped me personally, like mind shift on a couple of different aspects of leadership just in this conversation. I hope the audience gets the same out of listening to it. Where can folks find you? Where can they find your writings, your books?
You can find me, the most up-to-date workings that I have is on LinkedIn. So my name, charleneli.com and then you can also go to my website, charleneli.com to learn more about my books. It's a bit more static. LinkedIn is much more dynamic, but those are the two places. Look to my LinkedIn profile, my live streams, my weekly newsletters are there. You can sign up for them. And then also on my website, charleneli.com.
Charlene Li, current Chief Research Officer at PA Consulting. Fascinating approach and insights into the field of leadership. Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore, part of the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSP Magazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.